The night of February 18th, 1942 was black and moonless over the Caribbean, and an American freighter was running without lights through the approaches to the Panama Canal. At around 10:30, she shuddered, and something enormous scraped down her side and under her keel. Flames reportedly flashed on the water near her bow before dying just as quickly. Then the lookouts heard something worse, voices out in the darkness crying for help. Her officers assumed they'd run down a German U-boat, and by the fullest accounts, the freighter eventually circled back and swept the black water with a searchlight. What she found was a spreading slick of fuel oil and nothing else. The cries coming out of that water were in English, and the vessel that vanished that night wasn't German at all. She was the largest submarine ever built, the Surcouf. She was French, and more than 80 years later, no one has ever found her. France laid her down at Cherbourg in the late 1920s and commissioned her in 1934, and nothing like her existed anywhere on Earth. She measured 361 feet from bow to stern and displaced over 4,000 tons submerged, which made her the largest submarine in the world. She'd keep that title until Japan's I-400 class appeared near the end of the Second World War. The French classed her as a Corsair submarine, and the idea behind her was audacious. She was meant to cross oceans and hunt enemy shipping on the surface like a raider, then go under and disappear whenever real warships showed up. She went into the water in 1929, and her twin diesels could push her along the surface at better than 18 knots. She carried enough fuel to steam roughly 10,000 nautical miles without refueling, meaning she could reach a French colony on nearly any ocean on the planet. This was, in a way, similar to the capabilities of a modern nuclear submarine, or at the very least, a spiritual predecessor to those sort of capabilities. She also had substantial armaments designed to project power wherever she went, and this design would, for reasons I'll discuss, be what made her one of a kind. Forward of the conning tower sat a turret mounting twin 8-inch guns, the same caliber carried by heavy cruisers, with a range of roughly 16 miles. She carried torpedo tubes in 2 different calibers, anti-aircraft guns, a motorboat, and a watertight hangar housing a small float plane meant to spot targets beyond the horizon. There was even a compartment fitted out to hold 40 prisoners, because a commerce raider needs somewhere to put captured crews. When the major powers capped the size of submarine deck guns by treaty in 1930, she reportedly survived as a specifically permitted exception. The Surcouf was essentially one of one, and effectively it became illegal to build another one of her. The trouble was that she never worked very well, and she was slow to dive, reportedly needing more than 2 minutes to get under. That's a long time to sit on the surface as a 4,000-ton target that isn't capable of tanking shots from an actual warship or naval bomber. Her machinery broke down constantly, she handled poorly in heavy seas, and the float plane arrangement proved far more elegant on paper than in practice. She was named for Robert Surcouf, the Napoleonic-era privateer who'd tormented British shipping in the Indian Ocean. Like her namesake, she turned out to be better at capturing imaginations than anything else. When Germany overran France in the spring of 1940, Surcouf was in the middle of a refit at Brest. With enemy troops closing on the port on June 18th, she escaped in a state that should have kept her tied to the dock. Accounts describe her crossing the channel on one working engine, with a jammed rudder, unable to dive. She limped into Plymouth and accepted the protection of the Royal Navy, which lasted about 2 weeks. After France signed its armistice with Germany, Churchill became convinced the French fleet might end up in German hands. On July 3, 1940, Britain executed Operation Catapult, seizing French warships in British ports and attacking the French squadron at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria. Nearly 1,300 French sailors perished under British shells, while in the British harbors themselves the takeovers went smoothly almost everywhere. The exception was Surcouf, and before dawn, an armed boarding party led by Commander Dennis Sprague, captain of the British submarine Thames, came aboard her at Devonport. In the confrontation that followed below decks, a French officer pulled a pistol and started blasting. Sprague and 2 other British officers died in the fighting, and a French naval engineer was cut down as well. Those were reportedly the only deaths aboard any of the ships seized in Britain during the entire operation. 4 men perished on a submarine belonging to a country that had been Britain's ally 2 weeks earlier, and the bitterness of that morning never really washed off her decks. Her crew was marched off and interned, reportedly housed for a time at a racetrack near Liverpool. The British then had to decide what to do with a one-of-a-kind submarine they didn't trust and couldn't easily crew. The seizure poisoned nearly everything that came afterward, and most of her original crew refused to join Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement and chose repatriation instead. The tiny Free French naval force had to scrape together a replacement crew for perhaps the most complicated submarine on Earth. Command eventually passed to Georges Louis Blaison, a capable officer who reportedly had real affection for a boat few others wanted. He was reportedly the only officer from her original wardroom who chose de Gaulle over a ticket home. She spent 1941 doing work she was never designed for, escorting Atlantic convoys out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. Her slow dive time and temperamental machinery made her more liability than asset. British officers suspected there were Vichy sympathizers aboard, and some of the French crew suspected the British wanted the boat gone. A story later circulated that she'd been caught secretly refueling a German U-boat in Long Island Sound. That accusation had no evidence behind it whatsoever, since her movements during that period are well documented. In April 1941, she was damaged in a German air raid while sitting at Devonport. That summer, she crossed the Atlantic to the American Navy Yard at Kittery in Maine, where she spent roughly 3 months under repair, another sign of how hard her machinery was to keep alive. By late November, she was back on her way to Halifax and further operations in the New World. Admiral Émile Muselier, the commander of the Free French Navy, had crossed to Canada aboard Surcouf earlier that month, and her one moment of triumph came on December 24, 1941. On Christmas Eve, he led her and 3 Free French corvettes into the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. This was a small, Vichy-administered archipelago off Newfoundland, and the ships seized them without firing a shot. The residents welcomed the landing parties, and in a vote held the following day, roughly 98% of them backed Free France. Washington was furious, and the State Department had been carefully managing its relationship with Vichy and considered the Western Hemisphere off-limits to Gaullist adventures. Secretary of State Cordell Hull put out a statement dismissively referring to the operation as the work of the, quote, so-called Free French. The phrase backfired badly, with American newspapers and their readers siding overwhelmingly with the men who'd actually done something against a collaborationist regime. An American correspondent named Ira Wolfert had ridden aboard Surcouf during the operation, and his dispatches briefly made the giant submarine famous. It was the high point of her war, won over 2 small islands with a few thousand residents between them, without a single shell fired from her enormous guns. After Pearl Harbor, the Free French decided their flagship submarine belonged in the Pacific, where Free France still held scattered island territories. Surcouf was ordered toward Tahiti, with a final destination of Sydney, Australia, and the route ran through the Panama Canal. She left Halifax on February 2, 1942, put in at Bermuda, and departed again on February 12th, heading south toward Colon and the Atlantic mouth of the canal. By the night of February 18th, she was expected to be roughly 70 nautical miles north of the Panama Canal. That was the same stretch of darkness where that American freighter, the Thompson Likes, steaming alone, felt that grinding impact and heard English voices in the water. She never arrived anywhere, and there were around 130 men aboard, including a small Royal Navy liaison team, which is the detail that finally explains those cries in English. Not one survivor was recovered, and no confirmed wreckage was ever pulled from the sea. Measured in lives, it was the worst submarine disaster the world had seen, and by most reckonings it still is. The Free French didn't announce the loss until April 18, 1942, 2 full months after she vanished. The announcement said only that she was overdue and presumed lost with all hands at the bottom of the sea. The New York Times carried the news the following day, with no explanation of what had actually happened, because at that point, nobody on the Allied side was offering one. The link to the Thompson-Lykes collision wasn't made public until January 1945, nearly 3 years later. The official account has always been that there was a collision, and it fits the geography well. Surcouf's expected track put her almost exactly where the freighter struck an object, and no other Allied vessel was missing in those waters. Skeptics have poked at the details for decades anyway, and both ships were blacked out on a very dark night, which explains how they found each other. Doubters have asked why the damage to the freighter's front portion looked so modest for a collision with a submarine that big. Some of her crew reportedly described the shape in the water as much smaller than Surcouf, with some believing that the ship was actually a German sub. Under this theory, the calls out in English may have been the German crew calling out to what they knew to likely be an American crew. The most serious alternative theory to what happened to the French sub points at the sky rather than the sea. The author James Rusbridger, who dug through the files decades later, reported finding records of the U.S. Army's 6th Bombardment Group flying out of Panama. Those records describe its aircraft attacking and sinking a large submarine on the morning of February 19th, hours after the collision. No German U-boat is confirmed to have been lost in that area on that date. His suggestion was that the collision may have crippled Surcouf without sinking her, leaving her limping toward Panama on the surface with a dead radio. Unable to identify herself, she would have been mistaken for the enemy and finished off by American air crews. A French naval inquiry reportedly came to lean toward some version of friendly fire as well. Notably, both leading explanations end the same way, with the largest submarine on Earth perishing by Allied hands through pure accident. That also goes a long way toward explaining why nobody was eager to talk about it. Another theory is that she was making a run for Vichy-held Martinique when she was intercepted by the Americans. Another theory spices it up further, claiming she went down carrying gold that was to be funneled to the Axis. Under the Martinique theory, she was going to defect to the Axis powers, though this seems to be based primarily on rumors and distrust surrounding the crew. There's a monument to the Surcouf at Cherbourg, the port where she was built. Her name appears on the Free French Memorial at Greenock in Scotland, on a hill above the Firth of Clyde. The French Navy later named a ship for Blason, the commander who stayed loyal to her and went down with her. Aside from that, despite being the biggest submarine disaster in history, and despite being an unsolved mystery of the Second World War, the Surcouf is largely forgotten. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. In the pre-dawn darkness on the night of December 22nd to 23rd, 1944, 2 balls of orange light lifted off the ground near Hagenau, in Alsace, and climbed toward an American night fighter. According to the crew's report, the glows rose to the plane's altitude, leveled off, and settled onto the tail as if they'd been assigned to it. They held that position for 2 full minutes, while the 2 men aboard watched something that had no business existing over a battlefield. Then the lights peeled away, moving with what the report described as perfect control, and went dark. Nothing had fired at the plane, and nothing had touched it. The crew flew home, filed their account, and joined a growing list of Allied airmen describing the same impossible company in the night sky. The squadrons themselves were about to give that company one of the strangest names in military history. The men who did the most to put that name on paper belonged to the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, an American unit flying radar-equipped Bristol Beaufighters under Captain Harold Augsburger. The Beaufighters had been supplied to America through a reverse Lend-Lease because the American P-61 Black Widow night fighter was still coming online. Their trade was night intruder work over the Rhine Valley, hunting German aircraft and rail traffic in the dark. A Beaufighter crew was 2 men, a pilot up front, and a radar observer buried in the fuselage with his face pressed to a scope, with an occasional third observer brought along. Their survival depended on correctly identifying every light in the sky, instantly, every time. These weren't romantics or amateurs, they were professional observers of the night, and that's exactly what makes their reports so hard to dismiss. One night in late November 1944, while the squadron was still operating from its base outside Dijon, pilot Ed Schluter took off with radar observer Donald Myers. They were carrying the squadron's intelligence officer, Fred Ringwald, along as a third set of eyes. Flying up the Rhine north of Strasbourg, Ringwald reportedly noticed a cluster of 8 or 10 orange balls of light off the wing, moving fast and holding loose formation with the plane. Schluter's first guess was stars, then reflections from the ground, and ground radar reported nothing in the area. When Schluter turned into the lights, they vanished, then reappeared farther away, and after several minutes they went out entirely. The incident was logged at debriefing on November 27th, and it wouldn't stay unique for long. The squadron's surviving records, its war diary and mission report extracts, show how quickly things escalated through December. By mid-month, the unit had moved to a new field at Oche, near Nancy, and the lights followed. On December 15th, a crew logged a brilliant red light at 2,000 feet, traveling east at around 200 miles per hour. On December 17th, another crew reported 5 or 6 red and green lights, arranged in a T-shape that followed their aircraft through its turns. Then came December 22nd and 23rd, when the orange glows near Hagenau climbed up to meet pilot David McFalls and radar observer Ned Baker, and other crews logged fiery lights of their own. Another American night fighter crewman, Samuel Krasny, later recalled a wingless glowing red shape like a cigar that kept pace off his aircraft's wing during this period of the war. The lights appeared mostly over the German side of the lines, singly or in small groups, colored red, orange, white, or green. They paced aircraft flying at combat speed, sometimes for minutes at a time. They never fired on anyone and never collided with anyone. And according to Ringwald, ground control stations reported empty scopes every single time a crew called one in. Airmen who turned to chase them found nothing to chase, while airmen who ran found they couldn't pull away. The things behaved, more than one crew noted, as if they were under intelligent control, and yet they did no harm at all. The name came from Donald Myers, the radar observer on that November flight. Myers was from Chicago and a devoted reader of Smokey Stover, Bill Holman's bizarre firefighter comic strip in the Chicago Tribune. The strip's running nonsense gag held that where there was foo, there was fire, which was something that made no sense outside of the context of the comic. According to Ringwald, Myers came back from a harrowing mission, was asked at debriefing what he'd seen, and blurted out a profanity-laced version of the phrase that stuck instantly. The squadron sanded it down to Foo Fighters for polite company, and from there, the name would spread. In late December, an Associated Press war correspondent named Bob Wilson visited the squadron to chase the rumor. His story moved on the wire at the turn of the year and ran in American newspapers in the first days of January 1945. It put the phrase "Foo Fighter" on breakfast tables across the country without offering much in the way of explanation. In the coverage, Myers described the lights keeping pace with his plane at 260 miles per hour. He laid out 3 varieties the flyers had cataloged, including red balls of fire riding off the wingtips and a vertical row of 3 balls of fire flying ahead of the planes. There were also distant clusters of about 15 lights that flickered in the night like a Christmas tree. Newspaper readers had already been primed for strangeness, since mid-December dispatches had described silvery spheres floating over German airspace. They were noted as appearing singly and in clusters, and reports framed them as a possible new German superweapon. Time ran a piece on January 15th, 1945, titled "Foo Fighter," in which skeptical scientists suggested the airmen were seeing optical illusions or after images of light burned onto their own eyes. Newsweek, the same week, floated the opposite idea, that the balls of fire were real devices under radio control. Between those two poles, hallucination and secret weapon, the argument about Foo Fighters has essentially stayed put for 80 years. What separates the Foo Fighters from most wartime legends is that the worry ran all the way to the top, and the paperwork survives. Most of these myths and legends are simply dismissed by high command, but this wasn't the case here at all. On January 2nd, 1945, Major General Clayton Bissell, the Army's Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in Washington, sent a classified cable to Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters. He asked for an explanation of the reports coming out of Europe, and researchers who later combed the files never located a reply. In an internal memo of February 11, 1945, Air Commodore Charles Grierson wrote that the sheer number of reports meant there had to be something behind them beyond imagination. He arranged for a technical intelligence officer to look into it, and the British Air Ministry weighed in on March 13, 1945, with its best guesses. German flak rockets were the likeliest culprit, and jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt 262 were a possibility. The whole affair, the assessment admitted, remained a mystery resting on sketchy and varied evidence. Ringwald, for his part, compiled the encounters, 14 separate incidents, into a report that went up the chain to the 12th Tactical Air Command at the end of January. No agency ever announced a conclusion, and the war simply moved faster than the investigation. By the time anyone might have answered Bissell's cable, the phenomenon itself was disappearing. When Allied ground forces overran the territory east of the Rhine in the spring of 1945, the sightings in that sector stopped. That point was made in the earliest full account of the mystery, written by Joe Chamberlain in the American Legion magazine that December. It's the kind of detail that seems to hand the case to the secret German weapon theory. If the lights were German hardware, though, capturing the launch sites should have produced wreckage, blueprints, or prisoners who knew about the program. Despite numerous German scientists having been captured and shipped off to America, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, there was simply no evidence for the program. Scientists who were asked about Foo Fighter phenomenon specifically denied any knowledge. The 415th named the Foo Fighters, but they didn't discover them, and British bomber crews had been reporting inexplicable lights and objects shadowing them since 1942. In December of that year, a hurricane pilot over France reportedly watched 2 orange lights climb with him through thousands of feet before giving up the chase. Royal Air Force crews over the Balkans reported similar company in April 1944, believing they were some sort of sinister advanced German technology. That October, American crews of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, flying from Belgium, logged their own encounters over Western Germany weeks before the 415th's first sighting. In the Pacific, B-29 crews described balls of fire that trailed them over Japan. Those were sometimes attributed to enemy fighters, sometimes to the Japanese fire balloon campaign, without either explanation ever quite fitting the behavior the crews described. Some of those Pacific reports described glowing spheres that simply hung in the sky rather than giving chase, a hint that more than one phenomenon was being filed under one name. German and Japanese pilots reportedly saw similar lights during the war, though how many of those accounts survive scrutiny is a debate of its own. In the autumn of 1945, American intelligence officers put the question directly to 13 senior Luftwaffe officers, scientists, and engineers in custody. None of them claimed any knowledge of a German program that could account for the sightings. Whatever had been following the bombers, the men who supposedly built it had never heard of it. There's no shortage of candidate explanations, and each one covers part of the evidence while leaving a remainder. St. Elmo's fire, the electrical glow that builds on airframes in charged air, was an early favorite among scientists. St. Elmo's fire clings to propellers and wingtips rather than flying formation 100 yards off the wing, and veteran crews knew exactly what it looked like. Ball lightning fits the color and the eerie movement, but it remains so poorly documented that explaining Foo Fighters with it comes close to explaining one mystery with another. Flares, tracer, flak bursts, and burning aircraft were the ordinary furniture of a night over Germany. Night fighter crews were the last men in the world likely to be fooled by them for minutes at a stretch. Glowing jet exhausts from rocket-powered German planes could look uncanny in the dark, but these jets were rare. Jets couldn't loiter alongside a Beaufighter through hard turns and then vanish without a trace. The human eye is the other suspect, and in the spring of 1945, the Navy opened a research project on aviator vertigo and night vision. Its lead flight psychologist, Edgar Vinacca, argued that pilots were being sent into the dark badly undertrained about their own senses. A stationary light stared at in a featureless sky will appear to dart and swerve, an effect called autokinesis. An afterimage will faithfully follow every movement of the eye that carries it. That explanation handles a lot of Foo Fighter behavior, including the way the lights seem to match every maneuver. It strains against the cases where 2 or 3 crewmen watch the same object at the same time and describe the same thing. In 1968, an Italian writer named Renato Vesco claimed the Foo Fighters had been a real German device called the Feuerball. This was an unmanned, jet-propelled anti-radar drone supposedly built near Wiener Neustadt, a city in Austria. The claim has been repeated in books and documentaries ever since, and it rests on effectively nothing. No wartime document or factory record has ever surfaced to support it, and the only witness to the program anyone has ever produced is Vesco himself. Vesco claimed that he had witnessed the construction of these objects in his capacity as an officer in the Italian Air Force in World War II. The captured Luftwaffe officers questioned in 1945 point the other way entirely. The last official word came years later, from an unexpected direction. In January 1953, the CIA convened a panel of scientists under the Caltech physicist H.P. Robertson to review the flying saucer problem. The Foo Fighters were entered into evidence as the phenomenon's wartime ancestor. The panel's judgment was a shrug with a footnote, and the lights had been unexplained but harmless. They were probably some mix of electrostatic effects akin to St. Elmo's fire, electromagnetic phenomena, or reflections from ice crystals. The panel's report observed that if the term flying saucer had existed in 1944, that's what the crews would have called them. What the panel couldn't do, and what nobody has done since, is produce the explanation that covers all of it. That would have to cover the multiple witnesses, the empty radar scopes, the formation flying, and the way the lights dissolved out of the sky just as the ground beneath them changed hands. The men of the 415th went home, The mission reports went into the archives, and the file stayed effectively open. Whatever followed those crews up the Rhine did them no harm, and left nothing behind, and the most powerful air forces ever assembled never managed to put a name to it. It just flew formation in the dark, and then it was gone, remaining one of the most bizarre unsolved mysteries of the Second World War.